In other words, he is a fountain of knowledge on the subject. And I don't want to dismiss fountains of knowledge. I want to see what I can learn from Zahi. And I hope that he might learn something from me as well. And we might end up in a place where there is respectful disagreement, and we can openly discuss the mysteries of the past. That's what I would hope to get to.
That sounds beautiful. Have you ever seen the movie Stargate?
Long time ago.
Kurt Russell movie.
Yeah.
You know,
I have seen it.
There's a portal.
Yeah.
It's near the pyramids of Giza.
Yeah.
But I look at a lot of your work, and when it comes to the pyramids themselves lining up with Orion's Belt has always, across many cultures, been the place of ascension of souls.
Absolutely. It is here in North America, and in Central America, and in South America. The path of souls, that idea that on death our soul makes a kind of leap up to the heavens and then makes a journey along the Milky Way, and that journey is full of challenges and difficulties, on which we will be assessed for the use we made of the incredible gift of life. That idea is found all over the world. It's a universal idea, and it's one of the reasons why I propose that there's been a forgotten episode in human history, that we are looking at a legacy of an idea that was passed down to many later cultures from a remote common ancestor, going back to the end of the last
And
Ice
even
Age.
if you look at the king's shaft lines up with Orion, and the
Certainly
queen's
does,
shaft
yeah,
lines
yeah,
up with
yeah.
Sirius,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So it's this really interesting, precise alignment with constellations that...
The shafts of the king's chamber don't point at Orion, but one of the shafts of the queen's chamber does.
Okay.
And let's be clear. No king was ever buried in that chamber. These are all modern names that have been given by Egyptologists to these chambers to manifest their theory about why there's so many chambers inside the Great Pyramid. But we have no idea what the ancient Egyptians or anybody else ever called them in the past.
Do you have a best guess as to what these were ritualistically used for, given their alignment?
Given the intense focus of the ancient Egyptians on the mystery of life after death, on the mystery of life and on the mystery of death, actually, what happens to us. Most modern scientists of a very so-called rational persuasion, who believe that everything can be solved with weighing, measuring, and counting, will tell you, almost as though it's an absolute fact, that they've somehow established through experimentation that the soul, there is no such thing as the soul, and that it does not survive death. Of course, this is not a fact. This is a statement of a religious belief on the part of those scientists who view any such thing as mystical and nonsense. There is no experiment that could be done. Frankly, it's a mystery. None of us know. None of us know. None of us have a clue what happens. Maybe the so-called rational scientists are right. Maybe we are just meat robots, meaninglessly living out our existence here on Earth, producing and consuming. Maybe that's all we are. It could be, but I don't think it is. And the ancient our society pays no attention to these mysteries. The ancient Egyptians, that was their focus for 3,000 years, and they came to very, very, very definite conclusions about it. And those conclusions, I think, are very deep and very weighty and worth considering. And it's fascinating that the same idea is found all around the world. I get it why many different cultures might believe in life after death. The argument for that is people delude them. The rational scientists' argument for that is people delude themselves into believing there's life after death because they don't like the idea of coming to an end. But it's much more specific than that. It's not just life after death. It's this leap to the Milky Way. It's this journey through what is called it's called an underworld, but it's also in the sky. It's this journey through it. It's the challenges and ordeals that the soul will face along the way, where he or she will be held to account for the life they have lived, for that very specific set of notions to turn up all around the world. That's not an accident. That is a result, I believe, of a shared common influence. That this is something else that archaeologists, I think, don't really get. I think what's missing is an archaeology of ideas, and that ideas can live and can be passed on through stories, through traditions, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and they can remanifest again and again. So you can get cultures that are separated by not just thousands of years, but also thousands of miles, who are still manifesting these ideas. For example, the ancient Maya in Central America, and we go into this in one of the episodes of season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse, with a great archaeologist who doesn't hate me, you know, he agrees that this is a worldwide tradition. It's a very, very curious thing.
And there's this common trope too. You have King Judea of Sumeria saying that in a dream he was given this lapis lazuli, these tablets, saying that he has to build a temple with these specific astronomical alignments. You see the same thing with Pharaoh Tutmos in Egypt. You see the same thing with Aztec leaders, with Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
This sort of, you know, idea of you get this kind of download, or you have this divine connection, and then you must build this temple with these specific astronomical alignments. So I think that does point towards something having to do with the afterlife or some sort of ascension portal. I was even reading Ptolemy. Ptolemy, you know, is proto-astronomy, sort of like the in-between of like the astronomy we have today and, you know, whatever we had in the past. And he's writing in 100 AD in Roman times. Yeah. And he's saying that the, you know, soul's ascension path is through Orion's belt.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. The leap is always to Orion's belt. That's another of the common factors of this idea around the world tour, because Orion stands by the Milky Way. From there, you're on the Milky Way. Then you make your journey.
So are you getting to some sort of more true proto-architecture to religion that involves these sort of oral traditions passed down that cuts across geography?
Look, I'll give you 2 examples. I've tried to explain, and it's best done graphically, really, for this to be understood. The phenomenon of precession is, because the Earth is the viewing platform, I try to explain it in this way, from which we observe the stars, and because the Earth wobbles very slowly on its axis, and because that wobble unfolds a complete cycle in just under 26,000 years, the effect for us as observers is that the stars' orientation in the skies gradually changes, and the rising time of those stars in relation to the sun gradually changes, and the pole star gradually changes, because the extended north pole of the Earth is wobbling, and will sometimes point at empty space and sometimes point at other stars. Ours is Polaris, but it's been other stars in the past. So this is a very complex, very sophisticated process, which requires detailed observation. Now, as I've said, using precession and monumental architecture, the ancient Egyptians have built an enormous statement on the ground that speaks to the date that we call 10,500 BC, astronomically. It speaks to that date, about 12,500 years ago. Then jump over to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Look at Pillar 43 in Enclosure D. Look at the very interesting symbolism on that pillar, which includes a scorpion, which includes a vulture with outstretched arms, which includes a circle, which we believe resembles the sun on the wing of that vulture. What we find is that is very persuasively an astronomical diagram of the sky at the summer solstice 12,500 years ago. And the sun is on the arm of Sagittarius, is the constellation that we think is represented by that vulture figure. The fact that we call it Sagittarius, other cultures can call it other things and symbolize it as other things. But the fact is that the shape of that constellation is what is reflected on that pillar. And using precession, it marks out again that same date that the ancient Egyptians called the first time. And that's interesting, because Pillar 43 in Enclosure D has been dated to 11,600 years ago, but it's marking a date more than 1,000 years before that, 12,500 to 12,800 years ago. So that tells us that whoever built Göbekli Tepe, that previous date was as important to them as it was to the ancient Egyptians.
That's so fascinating.
I think so, yeah.
You write about this a little in your book, Talisman, with Robert Bauval, of this sort of quote-unquote organization that sort of hermetically transfers wisdom.
Yes, the passing down of knowledge over thousands of years does definitely involve some kind of organization. It's not going to happen randomly. It can happen in certain ways with stories. This is something that I came to understand way back in the late 1980s. And again, pay tribute to the work of others. Probably mentioned it to you before. Hamlet's Mill, Giorgio de Santillana.
MIT.
Not to be confused with the guy who presents Ancient Aliens. Giorgio de Santillana was a professor of history of science at MIT back in the 1960s. Hertha von Deschen, professor of the history of science at Frankfurt University. And you know, they have identified very ancient, very early knowledge of precession. I've been talking so much I've forgotten how we got on that point.
I brought up the organization.
Yes, the organization. So one way that ideas can be maintained is to embed those ideas in wonderful stories. Call them myths, if you like. Which the story itself is so compelling that people will keep on repeating it down the ages. The storyteller no longer has to have knowledge that there is secret information embedded in that story. As long as the storyteller keeps on repeating the story through, the secret information will continue to be passed down. And later cultures, if they're open-minded and have their eyes and ears open, may be able to decipher that information. That's one way that information can be preserved across thousands of years. It's one of the reasons why myths is so important to me, without any organization involved. But I think very clear in the case of ancient Egypt, whether you call them the followers of Horus, whether you call them the souls of Pe and Nekhem, that these were secret societies which were entrusted with preserving information from what they call the first time and passing it down to future generations. And although it may seem like a bit of a stretch, I suggest that information was preserved for thousands and thousands of years and constantly passed down. And when the time was felt to be right, ancient Egypt was switched on. And of course, it was switched on entirely by ancient Egyptians. This was thousands of years after the information had reached them and then was passed down through the generations and preserved. And it's hard to say why exactly the period of roughly 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, to 2500 BC, 4,500 years ago, was chosen as the time to switch on the engine of ancient Egypt. But interestingly enough, that's exactly the same period that the engine of the Indus Valley civilization was switched on in what is now Pakistan and northern India. It's exactly the same time that the Yellow River civilization was switched on. This is found, this date, this sudden emergence of civilization, as it's called, coordinates with that date all around the world. It's not just ancient Egypt. So again, that makes me feel that there's something behind it, and that we're probably missing a very important part of the human story that's behind it. And that part of the human story goes back to the last ice age, in my view.
That's linking all of these civilizational cycles. And we think of the birthplace of kind of Western civilization as the Hellenic period in the Greeks, but in fact, you point out that there's a really clear through line from Plato to the ancient Egyptians. You have Solon, and the myth, and
well, again, the Atlantis story is I've had so much scorn poured on me by archaeologists for taking the Atlantis story seriously, because they're convinced that it's just a sort of political fable that Plato made up in order to establish certain philosophical points about how governments should be.
And this was for the audience because it was told that this festival that was, mythos or whatever, was involved in sort of storytelling. I think mythology played there was more reality to a lot of what was transpired in these festivals.
That's right. I mean, you'll find the Atlantis story in the dialogues of Timaeus and Critias of Plato. And what the archaeologists say is that this is all just a fable. But in order to say that, they have to separate the Atlantis tradition from the global tradition of a great flood. That tradition is worldwide. There are roughly 200 flood myths from all around the world. There are very few parts of the world that don't have it. And there are many striking common features about those flood and cataclysm myths. It's one of the reasons we call our series Ancient Apocalypse, actually. And I regard the Atlantis tradition passed down to us by Plato as part of that.
Well, because it dates to 9,600 BC.
It's one of the very few traditions of a global flood that destroys a former civilization. As I say, there's up to 200 of them. It's one of the only ones which actually gives a date. And it gives that date because the Egyptian priests who read the hieroglyphs on the wall of the temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta to Solon and translated it for him. When he asked them, when did this happen? When did this place get destroyed? When was it submerged beneath the sea? They kind of matter-of-factly said, oh, well, 9,000 years ago. There's the date, because that was 600 BC. That's 9,000 years before 600 BC. That's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago, give or take 24 years before our time. And that is meltwater pulse 1b. That is one of the big sea level rise incidents that took place at the end of the Ice Age. So for Plato to have stumbled upon that, just randomly picked that date as some sort of grand fiction, seems to me absurd.
Well, I think once mythology starts to comport with actual events, we have to stop calling it mythology.
I believe so. I believe so. And I think what Plato did was, I think he took elements of a very ancient tradition which had been passed down to him by the ancient Egyptians. As he states in the Timaeus and Critias dialogues. He took elements of that were useful to him, and he left out other elements that weren't. But it's the connection to the worldwide tradition of a global flood that archaeologists completely ignore when they seek to dismiss the Atlantis tradition. And I think they need to take it on board. And rather than, excuse the language, rather than pissing on Plato, they should say, well, actually, what can we find from this? This is very interesting. Let's see if there's more to it than we imagine. Let's see if that date is significant in some way. And it is.
Well, I think a great other example would be the Peloponnesian War, where we said it was all mythology. It was all, the city of Troy did not exist. And then late 19th century, we figure out, oh, there actually was a city of Troy in modern Anatolia.
That's one of the great examples. And I think mythology needs to be used as a guide to the past, rather than kind of sneered at as fantasies made up by our primitive ancestors.
And the 19th century case with Troy, it was found by
Schliemann,
who was Heinrich von Schliemann, who was kind of this, he was a businessman, he was an outsider. Nobody in archaeology at the time respected him.
I know,
And they thought he was a fraud or
Some
whatever.
things never change.
Yeah, right. No,
archaeologists don't like outsiders.
Well, in the 19th century, you had all these guys. You had J.G. Fraser, who wrote The Golden Bough. You had all these anthropologists and guys who were contributing to the bedrock of what we now do, who kind of are more cut from your cloth than like this myopic paper-chasing academia cloth. There are these gentlemen journeyers who were very polymathic, and they had this wide view of, what was going on historically. And they would come to these amazing conclusions. And now we just, I don't know, we have these kind of nitpicker, people who...
I've often said, I've learned a great deal from archaeology. And there are many great archaeologists still today who are doing good work. And often they are the archaeologists who are attacked by their colleagues. But when it comes to criticism of archaeology, I find that archaeologists tend to circle the wagons around each other rather than deal with those criticisms face on. And so, speaking of archaeology as an institution rather than individual archaeologists, I would say that it appears to me that the mission of archaeology as an institution is the kind of mission of a vampire. They want to suck all the blood out of the ancient past. They want to drain the past of its blood, of its vitality, of its mystery, of everything that makes it worthwhile looking into, and leave this stuff that can just be counted and weighed and measured. They're so desperate to be seen as scientists that in order to be regarded as scientists, they've literally thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And we end up with this dry discipline which is extremely unattractive in many ways and fails to do justice to the romance and the beauty and the mystery of the past. And that is why people are interested in the past. They don't want the weighing and measuring and counting to dominate the debate. There's a great place for weighing and measuring and counting, but for that to have a monopoly on our understanding of the past, that's a mistake. The past is too big a subject for one small discipline of scholars who include a very vocal subgroup who wish to destroy any alternative ideas. It's wrong for such a small group to have this death grip on the past and to claim that they're the only ones who have a right to speak of the past.
I couldn't agree more. And I think the same thing happens to Plato. The people who claim that Plato has no say on what actually, he's not a historian, you know, he was just some philosopher or whatever. I think philosophers actually do the same thing. Modern philosophers do the same thing to Plato, where they say things like the myth of air holds no metaphysical bearing on what he actually believed. Or they call it the cave allegory because it's just an allegory, right? Well, what if Plato actually believed we live in a cave and there's some, you know, light we can glimpse outside of the cave, and that the myth of air is sort of...
Anybody who's had prolonged and deep experience of altered states of consciousness will know that we do live in a cave. Our perceptions are so channeled into the physical world, which they need to be. We do need to know the laws of physics, but we're so focused into the physical realm that we tend to shut our eyes, to be closed off to a much wider reality that surrounds all of that.
And so what do you think? You know, you wrote a great book called Supernatural, and we've talked about Jacques Vallée before and how you believe, you know, a lot of what people experience through psychedelic experiences. I know you've done ayahuasca many times and other things as well. You've experienced some of these entities in those journeys. Do you believe that encapsulates the modern alien conversation? Because there's also this sort of government disclosure thing around nuts and bolts and UFO crash recoveries.
Well, I always go back to, I was fortunate to know the Peruvian shaman Pablo Amaringo.
And I didn't know you knew him.
I did, and had his permission to reproduce a number of his images in my book Supernatural, which has recently been retitled Visionary in the United States with a new forward and afterward, but the main text remains the same. I did ask Pablo specifically why he is painting UFOs in his flying saucers, literally. That's what they look like. And I said, are you telling us that we're being visited by beings from other planets? What are these flying saucers that you're depicting? And again, very matter of fact, he said, oh, well, those are vehicles for entering and leaving the spirit world. That's what he said they were. So maybe there is some physical tech that can gain access to other realms of reality. But we do know that there is a neurological tech that gives access to that. And that is the powerful psychedelics like dimethyltryptamine, which is the active ingredient of ayahuasca, which do completely change our setting and our state of consciousness and allow in all kinds of material that we normally keep out, and give us access to that material. So I think that whatever the UFO mystery is, it is going to be solved by more than one approach, and perhaps the most fruitful approach is through the mystery of consciousness and what happens in deeply altered states of consciousness. So we now know that all around the world, fortunately, science is progressing, and we do in some ways, and we know that at a number of centers now, Imperial College in London, University of California at San Diego, that work is being done with volunteers. They are being given dimethyltryptamine by intravenous drip.
Yes.
Now that's interesting because some of our audience will have experienced DMT, and normally when we experience DMT, we're going to smoke it or vape it. And when you smoke or vape DMT, you're into a 10-minute, just utterly overwhelming journey to the other side of reality. And it's so overwhelming that it's often quite difficult to remember exactly. You know something happened to you.
Yes.
You know you did have encounters. There were sentient others out there who you communicated with, but it's hard to remember it. So what they're doing at these two universities, one in Britain, one in the US, what they're doing is they found a new technology, and I'll mention my colleague Andrew Gallimore, who's one of and Rick Strassman as well, very important in the invention of this technology, whereby it's possible to keep volunteers in the peak DMT state for as long as you want. Typically they keep them under for an hour, but they could stay under for days, because unlike, as far as I know, any other psychedelic, you never build up tolerance to DMT. If you take LSD 3, 4, 5 days in a row, by the 5th day, you're not going to have a trip at all. Your body's become so tolerant of it, you have to take a break before you'll have any more experiences. But with DMT, you can just keep taking it every day. And you will not build up tolerance to it. So they're using that particular special, unique characteristic of DMT to see what happens when people are plunged into this experience for much longer than 10 minutes. And those volunteers are all coming back with reports of encounters with sentient others. And there is an interesting group now who are called Sentient Others, made up by these volunteers who are now exchanging notes. They didn't exchange notes when they were volunteers because that was part of the protocol. But now that they've stopped being volunteers, they're exchanging notes, and astonishing similarities are being found. And these similarities are of encounters with sentient beings who communicate with us and seem to have an urgent message to impart to us. They want to know us, and they want us to know them. And it seems that there is something of great value in this connection between the two.
And a lot of people come out of these experiences saying they are more real than real.
More real than real. Yeah.
More real than our sort of waking life.
Yeah, definitely. There is another way that you can have a prolonged exposure to DMT, and that is the ayahuasca brew. Because the active ingredient of ayahuasca is DMT. The other ingredient is from the vine. It's particularly the harmine in the vine, which acts as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that allows the DMT to be absorbed orally. And an ayahuasca experience can last 4 or 5 hours, maybe more. But there's the distraction of the vomiting and the diarrhea, which makes it kind of difficult at times to focus on your journey.
Yes.
It's a really good idea to fast for a day before an ayahuasca trip.
Getting the vine, because like out of hundreds of thousands of species in the Amazon,
Yeah.
like who inspired the first people to put ayahuasca?
I think it's a tribute to the scientific nature of shamanism. The more time I've spent with shamans, particularly in the Amazon, the more aware I become of how they are constantly experimenting with plants. But this is an almost supernatural achievement, since there are 2 kinds of ayahuasca, really. One is called yahe, and the other is called ayahuasca. What they both have in common is the ayahuasca vine. They both have the ayahuasca vine in common, which contains this monoamine oxidase inhibitor that allows DMT to be absorbed orally. But the source of DMT is different from in yahe than it is in ayahuasca. In the case of ayahuasca, it's the leaves of a bush called Psychotria viridis. It's known as chacruna in the Amazon. In the case of yahe, it's the leaves of another vine. And that vine is called Diplopteris cabrerana. Those leaves contain DMT, and they contain not only NN-DMT, which is the more known one, but also 5-MeO-DMT. And I can say, because my most recent experience was with yahe. And
that must be overwhelming.
It was incredibly powerful experience.